it reminds me of something that I was testing today. I was doing a lighting test outside of my front yard, and uh, I wanted to test how to film in daylight correctly. Because in my mind, in my opinion, the correct way to film outside is to have it backlit, right? The sun is backlighting the subject. And then, and you expose for the face maybe. I don't know. I don't know exactly what you should expose for, but I think you should expose for the face maybe, right? Um, and I was just trying to figure that out. Like, what are the ratios and like, what are the challenges? What do I like? What like what do I don't like? What do I not like? And it was an interesting experiment. And one of the things that became clear to me was a problem I had run into a couple years ago when I was filming from in my room like right now, but I was pointing out the window so I could see out the window. And the problem was that the exposure ratio is just so much, especially with digital cameras. The exposure ratio, contrast ratio is just so high. And it was one of those things where I was like, I do a lot of comparisons. Well, I'll find a commercial that I think looks really good, and then I'll go and try to mimic or copy that commercial shot for shot. I think it's very educational. So I put this image up that I shot from inside my room, filming, and you're able to see out the window. I put that next to this commercial that I found. And I'm like, why is the commercial's footage better? Like it was done by one of the top-notch cinematographers in the industry, so it looked incredible. And it was just a very simple, just like like shot of a bedroom, like kind of looking out the window. And I was like, why does his look so much better than mine? I got my lighting as dialed in or as close as I can get it. Why? What's different? And I realized, oh, something I wasn't even looking at was the waveform, in that the highlights in his waveform were cresting like well below clipping range. It was like in like 768 out of 1024. It was in that range, and I was like, and then his contrast, his shadows were like 128, on the IRE. And I was like, oh, and in my comparatively, my shadows, my highlights were clipping, just clipping. It looked nice. The image itself looked nice, but the highlights were just clipping. They were way up there, and like the blacks were almost like 50 maybe. And they go, oh, it took a long time before I kind of realized that, or I knew to look at those data points and be like, oh, my image might look nice, but that extra 10% is because he's really controlling the highlights and really controlling the shadows. And that was something that I really wanted to figure out in my own test. So that fast forwards me to today when I was doing my lighting test outside. What I have a tree in my front yard, and the sun comes and it backlights the tree. And so I was trying to get myself so the subject, was standing in the sunlight, so completely being backlit by sunlight. And then, but my face would kind of be, it would be lit with whatever the surrounding area was. And so then the camera would just be wherever it would be in like a regular kind of three-quarter profile, or like a profile shot or close up, something like that. Medium close up, I think, is what I framed it for. And I said, let's just put it down and see what we get and see what we like, see what we have to do. And I go, okay, first, I realized I need a lens hood because the sun was coming in right at my lens and it was making everything kind of lose contrast. So I put it underneath the shade, but me still being in the sun. So I had to figure that out. Then another thing that happened was I realized there's a second problem, which is if I can see the surrounding area, I can see the trees, I can see the leaves through which the sun is coming through. Those are like being blown out. If I expose for my face, which is in not shadow, but just whatever bounce back the area was, I would be way blowing out the leaves. They would clip. You know what I mean? Because it's out of focus, it still looks nice to my eye, but we'll get to that later. It still looks nice, but it's clipping. You're not controlling those highlights. You might be exposing for the face, which is correct, but you're not exposing the highlights. So I'm like, what's the most elegant way, the most non-destructive, the least brute force way I could control these highlights? Like, I don't want to just stop down to like a F16. Technically, I was getting an F32 coming back from just the backlight on my hair. So I'm like, I don't want to stop down that far, and everything, it just looks like such a a grainy, tight kind of just like just unappealing image. Like I don't find digital cameras do well when you stop all the way down. So I'm like, I want to keep it at f4, but then I don't want to up my shutter speed. You know, um, and then if I so so then I'm like, okay, I can use an ND filter, and that honestly would be fine. But then, well, okay, I would use an ND filter because yeah, I'd want to open up to make the background go softer, which is less offensive when you blow out highlights, is to have it in soft focus. So maybe that will work and get away with that without keeping in full control of them. But I'm like, it's a problem because the highlights are so high and the face is in relative shadow to that. It's hard to expose for both. It's hard to find a good kind of clean, elegant way to expose for both. So it's just something I noticed. I didn't get a chance to fix it, but it was something that I was aware of. And yeah, I think that's one of those things that I was just trying to figure out today. I think what I would do in theory if I were to do it next time would be to use the ND filter, go down to a f4 at the very least, and ideally you'd be at a f2. But I don't know. Sometimes some of f2 seems like a little too bright for sunlight. I don't know, but at f4 you would, number one, the highlights would get softer because they're that much more out of focus, so it's more pleasant already. But to actually bring the exposure down of the highlight, that's how you would do it. You should put however many NDs on to rein them in, and but it's hard because if I'm getting an F32 back from just what's hitting my head, what are the actual exposure of the leaves hitting the trees? You can probably say it is still F32, but you'd have to use a pretty hefty ND filter. Then you got to think, what is that ND filter doing to the color of your image? Because it's stopping down so much, you're bound to get some color shift on even the most expensive NDs. So I'm like, you're compromising there. And then, yeah, I think I would just do that. Because then, yeah, so you get control of your highlights. Then you would, but see, then there's the problem of exposing the face. So then you got to get into the ugly bounce, that I never think looks good. I'm sorry. I can never get a daylight bounce to look good. I don't know what everyone else is doing, but I can't get mine to look good. It just, and that's what I mean by making an elegant choice versus making, like, I don't know, an ugly choice. What's ugly is to just put a giant bounce. Maybe my bounces aren't big enough, but like put a giant bounce and light up their face so their exposure's more even to what's coming through the trees. But I've never done it to look good. Like maybe I'm doing it wrong, but that's an unelegant way. That's probably the best way, the most necessary way, but it's the most unelegant. It's the most ugly way. More just like brute force, just like here, put the exposure up. That's kind of to me what the category I put it in. But I think I would just have to embrace that though. As much as I don't like that, I would just have to embrace it. What I would do would make, I would, so let's start over so I don't lose you. Number one, I arrive to the scene, I put the camera down. Okay, backlight coming through the trees, and then backlighting the subject. Faces in, not in shadow, but just in whatever general bounds. Number one, take an ND filter, get the highlights down to whatever they, I would say, 800 ISO, IRE, 800 IRE. And then I would just, that I would make sure that's there, right? Then I would come to an F4, just choose F4, and again, adjust the ND until those highlights are still sitting at 800. And then I would get a 16-foot by 16-foot bounce. I would. Huge bounce. And put it to the, I don't know, sort of front quarter lighting the subject. But then you book light it. You get a large source, a large diffusion source, and you create a book light for that bounce. So again, if this is the shot, let me make sure I'm still recording. Okay, running out of battery. Also, you can't see anything on the screen, can you? Maybe you can. I don't know. You book light it. So what you do is, whatever. What you do is, okay, if this is the shot from the subject looking at camera, the backlight's hitting me here. You put a bounce here. Okay? So that bounces the backlight into the face, but then instead of just a straight bounce, which can look a little harsh, you add a diffusion source here in front of it. So that will get all that bounce light and then diffuse even more to get a more even bloomier, softer source. I don't hear a lot of people book lighting daylight sources. That's something I'd really be interested in experimenting with, because I've just never heard of people doing that. You might, future me, might want to get a mirror bounce rather than just a white ultra bounce, because number one, white, the regular bounce doesn't tend to bounce as much light, especially if you're going to diffuse it again. It's not as much light as getting on you. So that's one of the things I would do. And that way, hopefully, you're getting a good exposure. It might look very sourcey is my only big problem. So that's why I say the bounce light. You get a big bounce, so it's not so sourcey. And then that probably will still be too bright. So then you just diffuse it again. Hopefully the diffusion will, you know, still have a good exposure. You can move it further from the subject to play with that exposure, but you might end up with that. You know, that might look good, but there's a way the movies get it. I just don't know how to do it. That's still elusive to me. I think I'm out.